The wind whispered through the clinking cups. It was one of those gray afternoons where even the sun seemed tired. Inside a forgotten diner off Route 66, a waitress wiped the counter as the hum of voices filled the air. Then she saw him, a little boy, dirty, hungry, and alone. No one offered him a thing, except her. But what she did for that boy would change her life forever. Because the next day, the road roared with justice. Stay till the end, because this story proves brotherhood is louder than fear. Her name was Grace Miller, though few ever bothered to remember it. She was just the waitress from the highway, the one who smiled even when the world gave her nothing to smile about. Every morning, before the first light brushed the horizon, she would tie her hair, put on her faded apron, and step into that little roadside diner where the smell of burnt coffee and gasoline mixed with the sound of worn-out jukebox songs and restless truck engines outside. She worked double shifts that blurred into each other, serving meals to strangers whose faces she would forget by nightfall. Men with hands blackened by oil, women chasing horizons they would never reach, and travelers who treated her kindness like part of the menu. There was a stillness in her eyes, a kind of quiet storm that lived beneath the surface, the look of someone who had learned to survive not because life had been kind, but because surrender had never been an option. Her voice carried warmth, yet her smile hid fatigue. Every gesture was gentle, yet weighed by the invisible heaviness of a woman who had seen too much disappointment to expect anything else. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the power lines and the air turned thick with dust, a boy walked into the diner, small, dirty, clutching a torn backpack that looked heavier than he did. He didn't ask for much, only a cup of coffee to warm his hands, maybe a place to rest before the night swallowed the road again. But before he could even finish his sentence, the manager's voice cut through the air like a blade. "We don't serve charity here," he barked, his words echoing through the diner like a door slamming shut. The boy froze, shame rising in his eyes, and for a moment the room went silent. No forks clattering, no murmurs, just the sound of rejection hanging heavy in the air. Grace stood still behind the counter, her hand gripping a coffee pot as if deciding whether to pour or to act. Then, without a word, she untied her apron, folded it slowly, and laid it on the counter, the kind of small rebellion that speaks louder than anger. She stepped outside, the doorbell ringing faintly behind her, and found the boy sitting on the curb, his small hands tucked into his sleeves against the cold. She bought him that cup of coffee herself, wrapped his fingers around it, and smiled, not out of pity, but out of recognition. Because Grace knew what it felt like to be invisible, to be turned away, to be told you didn't belong. She didn't know his name or where he came from, and she certainly didn't know that in one of the corner booths, a man in a leather jacket had been watching everything in silence, memorizing her face and the quiet courage in her eyes that would soon set the road ablaze. The man who witnessed it wasn't just another stranger passing through the highway. He had the kind of presence that silenced a room without a word. Broad shoulders beneath a weathered leather vest, a face carved by sun, wind, and time, and eyes that had seen too much of what the world hides behind its smiles. On his chest, a patch, Hell's Angels, California chapter, caught the dull light of the diner's neon sign like a flicker of fire against nightfall. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply watched, quietly, intently, the way men who have lost more than they can count tend to watch the few still capable of kindness. And as he saw Grace place that cup of coffee in the boy's trembling hands, something inside him stirred, a faint echo of what he once believed the world had burned out of him long ago. Her gesture, small as it seemed, burned into his memory like a scar, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that reminds you that light still exists, even when it has no reason to. Outside, the sky bled gray into the horizon. By the time the boy finished the last drop of coffee, the rain had begun to fall. Slow at first, then heavier, washing away his small footprints along the roadside. Grace returned to her shift, unaware that somewhere beyond those power lines, fate had just changed its course. Because in that fleeting moment, witnessed by a silent rider, her compassion had become a spark, and sparks on the road don't die quietly. That night, the boy disappeared into the storm, swallowed by the rain and the hum of distant engines. Grace went home beneath the hiss of the downpour, her tired shoes soaking through, her thoughts already drifting toward another long day to survive. She never imagined that her quiet act of defiance had set something vast into motion, something forged in chrome, leather, and loyalty. Because in the world of riders, justice doesn't fade, it rides. And when dawn broke over the desert hills the next morning, the silence shattered. The air trembled as the first engines came alive, one by one, their sound rising like thunder called from the bones of the earth. Somewhere between the horizon and the diner, an old debt was being repaid, and this time the road itself would carry the message. If you believe loyalty still matters, subscribe to Hell's Road, because stories like this are far from over. By the time dawn crawled over the horizon, the road outside the diner had begun to tremble. A low hum grew in the distance, not the sound of traffic, but of engines breathing in unison, the deep, rhythmic thunder of men who ride not for glory, but for remembrance. Their shadows stretched long across the cracked asphalt, merging with the early light until the whole parking lot looked alive, pulsing with the heartbeat of steel and loyalty. Inside, the first customers froze mid-bite as the air grew thick with the growl of motorcycles. The jukebox stuttered into silence, coffee cups trembled against their saucers, and for a single suspended moment, The world seemed to hold its breath. Grace turned toward the window, her reflection framed against a rising storm of chrome and leather. The sight was unreal. Dozens of bikes lined shoulder to shoulder, engines rumbling like thunder trapped beneath the earth. One by one, the riders cut their engines, and the sudden quiet that followed was somehow louder than the noise that came before. Boots hit the ground. The sound of chains and zippers filled the air like the preparation of an unseen ritual. Every eye in the diner followed the man who stepped through the door, the same man who'd sat silently in the corner the night before. He stood there for a moment, the sunlight catching the edge of his patch. Hell's Angels, California chapter. Before his gaze found hers. His eyes were cold, not cruel, but worn by years of roads that didn't forgive softness. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of something more powerful than anger.
"You're the one who fed the boy, right?" Grace hesitated, the words catching in her throat, unsure whether to nod or run. But something in his tone, a quiet respect, made her simply nod, her confusion written across her face. The man's expression shifted, just slightly, a faint, tired smile that seemed to come from somewhere deep behind the scars and miles he carried. He reached into his vest and placed something on the counter, a worn silver keychain, its metal etched with a set of wings. "That boy," he said, his voice softening, "was the son of a fallen brother." The diner fell silent again. Outside, the rest of the riders stood motionless, heads bowed, the early light glinting off their helmets like a sea of ghosts returned to honor one of their own. "And today," he continued, eyes fixed on her, "we came to thank you." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Grace didn't move. She couldn't. In that moment, surrounded by the stillness of men who lived by a code older than law, she realized she hadn't just given a boy a cup of coffee. She had unknowingly shown mercy to a piece of someone's past. And now the road had come back to repay the debt.
They filled the parking lot like an army of steel and memory, the rising sun catching the chrome on their bikes and scattering it across the diner's windows like shards of fire. The ground seemed to pulse beneath the weight of their presence, a steady vibration that carried something deeper than sound. It carried purpose, brotherhood, and the quiet promise of men who don't forget kindness, no matter how small. Inside, the smell of oil and dust followed them like a shadow. The customers, still frozen in silence, watched as the first rider, a man with hands scarred from both work and war, stepped forward and laid an envelope on the counter. It landed softly, but the sound echoed with the weight of meaning. Without a word, another man followed, pulling from his vest a worn patch, the same emblem stitched over his heart, and placed it gently beside the envelope. The red and white thread caught the light, glowing faintly as if alive. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't a symbol of pity. It was something sacred, a mark of respect from those who live by the road and die by their code. Grace looked down, unable to speak. Her hands trembled slightly as she realized that whatever was happening wasn't about charity. It was about honor. The kind of honor that can't be bought, can't be demanded, only earned in moments when no one is watching. So you remember there are still good roads out there, one of them said, his voice calm, deep, and lined with years. The words carried more than gratitude. They carried belief, a reminder that decency still mattered in a world too used to forgetting it. They stood there, silent and proud, their colors like armor, symbols of loyalty stitched in leather, worn by men who had seen both the beauty and the ugliness of the open road, and still chose to ride for something pure. The patches on their backs were not decorations, they were stories, written in scars and miles, in loss and redemption. And as Grace's eyes moved from one face to another, she realized that this gathering of rough souls and roaring hearts was what brotherhood truly meant. Not violence, not fear, but remembrance. You can carry that same spirit too, the same defiant flame that burns through dust and darkness, with the official Hell's Road gear linked below for those who live by the code, for those who still believe that loyalty is not just a word, but a way of life. The leader turned to her one last time before leaving, his eyes steady beneath the brim of his helmet, the morning light outlining his silhouette like a ghost of iron and resolve. His voice was almost a whisper when he spoke, not a warning, not a farewell, but a promise. When the world forgets the good ones, he said, pausing for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we don't. And with that, he turned, his boots echoing on the tiled floor, the sound fading into the rising chorus of engines outside, a hymn of gratitude sung in steel and thunder. The moment hung in fragile silence, the air inside the diner thick with tension and the faint smell of gasoline that clung to leather and dust. Then suddenly the sharp sound of footsteps broke through the stillness. The manager stormed out from the kitchen, his voice trembling with anger, shouting for them to leave, waving his hands like a man trying to command a storm. But the storm was already there, and it did not answer to him. He froze mid-step when the leader turned his head, his gaze cutting through the noise like a blade through smoke. There was no threat in that look, no need for words or violence. It was the kind of stare that carried the weight of roads traveled, brothers buried, and codes never broken. It was a silence that demanded respect, heavy as thunder, ancient as the asphalt beneath their boots. The manager's voice faltered, his anger dissolving into fear, then shame. He stepped back slowly, as if realizing that he stood before something far greater than himself, something he couldn't understand but instinctively knew not to challenge. The only sound that followed was the soft clink of a coffee cup settling on porcelain, and the faint hum of engines idling outside, waiting. Grace stood frozen behind the counter, her hands still trembling, her eyes wide and glassy under the dim neon light. Tears welled but did not fall, the kind that come not from sadness but from being overwhelmed by the weight of decency in a world that had long forgotten it. She looked at them, at all of them, and for the first time in years she saw what real respect looked like. It wasn't loud, it wasn't forced, it simply existed, carved into silence. Around her, the customers said nothing. Forks lay abandoned on plates, conversations left unfinished. Every gaze followed the riders as they turned, moving as one, their steps slow and deliberate, like soldiers returning to a sacred duty. The air outside shimmered in the morning heat as they mounted their bikes one by one, the engines coming alive with deep, rumbling heartbeats that seemed to shake the walls themselves. Grace stood at the window, her reflection merging with the blur of chrome and sunlight. As the first engines roared, she pressed a trembling hand to her chest, not out of fear, but out of gratitude for something she couldn't quite name. Then came the sound, a chorus of power and grace, rising, rolling, echoing down the long stretch of highway until it became part of the horizon itself. The ground vibrated with their departure, a tide of thunder receding into distance. And when they were gone, what they left behind wasn't chaos, nor fear, nor spectacle, but dignity, the kind that lingers long after the sound has faded, carried on the wind like a promise.
That night, the diner finally fell silent again. The neon signs outside flickered faintly, their glow reflecting off the rain-specked windows like dying embers refusing to fade. The hum of engines had long disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind an emptiness that wasn't loneliness, but peace, the kind of stillness that only comes when something sacred has passed through. Grace moved slowly through the quiet room, her steps soft against the worn floor, the echoes of the day still lingering in her chest like the aftertaste of thunder. The smell of coffee and exhaust hung in the air, mixing with something new, something lighter, almost holy. On the counter, where the envelope and the patch had been left, she found a single beam of moonlight resting gently across the leather wings, as if the night itself wanted to keep them illuminated. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the patch, the emblem rough against her skin, the stitches frayed from miles of road and years of brotherhood. It was more than a symbol. It was a story, a memory, a vow. Slowly she lit a candle from behind the counter, shielding the flame with her hand as it flickered to life. She placed it beside the patch, watching how the light danced across the red and white thread, breathing warmth into something once cold. For a long time she stood there, just watching, just feeling. The woman who once thought no one ever saw her, the waitress forgotten by faces and days, now carried the weight of a gesture that had reached beyond her small world. She wasn't just a tired worker behind a counter anymore. She was part of something greater, something older, something that lived beyond names or borders, a brotherhood bound not by blood, but by decency, loyalty, and the road itself. Outside, a distant rumble of engines rolled faintly through the night, like a farewell or a promise. Grace smiled, her reflection shimmering in the candlelight, and whispered softly into the still air, not words of thanks, not prayers, just a quiet acknowledgement that she had been changed forever. Some roads lead to redemption, others to memory. If you want to keep the fire alive, the Hell's Road store is linked below, where brotherhood lives beyond the story.
Days passed, and the rhythm of the diner returned. The clinking of cups, the hum of the jukebox, the steady whisper of passing cars. Yet something in the air had changed, something that no one could name but everyone could feel. It was as if the place itself had been blessed by the echo of engines, as though the sound of brotherhood had soaked into its walls and refused to leave. Grace moved through her days with the same quiet grace she always had, but now her steps carried a kind of peace she had never known. Every morning she would light that same candle and set it beside the patch, and sometimes when the wind pushed through the cracks in the door, the flame would flicker as if answering a call from far down the highway. Every time the low, distant growl of a Harley rolled past the diner, Grace would pause without meaning to, her hands stilling on the counter, her heart beating a little faster, her lips curving into a faint smile she didn't fully understand. Maybe it was gratitude, maybe it was memory, or maybe it was because somewhere deep inside she had learned a truth that only the road could teach, that even the smallest act of kindness, given without expectation, can awaken giants who still ride through the world carrying the last pieces of humanity. The boy never returned. No one ever found out where he came from or where he went. Yet his presence lingered in every corner of the diner, in the chair by the window where he had once sat, in the steam rising from every cup of coffee she served with an open heart, in the quiet moments before dawn when the road outside lay empty and waiting. Grace sometimes thought of him as she wiped down the counter at closing time, looking out on the endless stretch of asphalt lit by the soft glow of streetlights. She didn't need to see him again to know that what happened mattered, that kindness, once given, never truly disappears. It just changes form, riding invisible beside those who still remember. The road, after all, keeps its secrets, and some of those secrets, the best ones, are carried by the wind. This was one of many forgotten legends of the road. Subscribe to Hell's Road and ride with us into the next story.